first ones, the ones that we will all know more than any of the others, were the Pharisees. And they were the biggest group of religious leaders. And they were very, very strict. And they had lots and lots of rules and regulations that people had to follow minutely to the detail. And if you got one of the rules wrong, then as far as they were concerned, you weren't in a good place with God. It was all about the rules and regulations. And they thought that they were very, very religious. And they thought that they were better than a lot of other people. But they did agree with Jesus about some things. In fact, some people thought that Jesus himself might have been a Pharisee. They had a respect for the law, they believed in the resurrection, they were committed to obeying God. But on other things, they didn't agree with Jesus. They were arrogant and they looked down on people. And yet, the ordinary people looked up to them because they were thought that they were very powerful and they were good at living out their Jewish faith. Now, the next group we know of is the Sadducees. And they were a religious party, but they were good friends with the Romans, so they were always very popular. They were very wealthy. And they were part of the upper classes, so you couldn't just become a Sadducee. It was something that you tended to follow on from the rest of your family. And they made a lot of money. And they got a lot of their money from the temple. So when Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, they were greatly upset because it looked like Jesus was questioning their authority and what they did. And the next group were the scribes, and along with the Pharisees, these were the group that Jesus most had a run-in with. They would spend all their time studying the law and reading it and interpreting what it said. So they said that if your donkey fell into a ditch on the Sabbath, which for them was Saturday, Sundays for us, if your donkey fell into a ditch on a Saturday, you had to leave him where he was until the next day, because if you lifted him out, you were doing some work. I have a friend who lives next door to some Jewish people, and on a Friday she goes into their house to switch their lights on, because if they switch their lights on, it's classed as working, and that's what the scribes did. And they were very quick to follow Jesus because they were testing to see whether he stuck to the law or not. And the last group is the Herodians. And they weren't a political party and they weren't a religious party, but they were very, very important. And they didn't like the political upheaval that Jesus was bringing because they thought it threatened their future and what they wanted. And all four of these groups were really different. There was no love lost between them. They didn't like each other very much. But when it came to Jesus, they all had one thing in common. They all disliked him. You could even go so far as to say they all hated Jesus. So even though they might have been different, when it came to Jesus, they had a common enemy. And they came together to try and do away with Jesus. So we're going to have our first Bible reading, and it's Zoe and Annie who are going to read it for us. Thank you. And then Ben's going to follow with the next. You really get the idea, don't you, that Jesus didn't like the religious leaders, and they didn't like him very much. And you'd have expected them to have got on, because after all, they were all on the same side. They were all on God's side. And yet, they just didn't get on at all. Many of Jesus' run-ins with the religious leaders started shortly after he began his ministry, and they continued all the way through. And it culminated in Jesus' arrest, his illegal trial, and his execution. And it started with the fact that they never ever got on. But what was it about Jesus that was so threatening to them? What was it about them that was so offensive to Jesus? He loved them, as he loved everyone, but he hated their religious mentality. The way that he made everyone follow the rules and the regulations, the way they looked down on other people and said, you're not good enough and you're not good enough. And they hated the way that he called them out on their arrogance, their hypocrisy. They felt humiliated and wounded. He attacked their authority and the way that they practiced their religion. But he saved his greatest arguments for the scribes and the Pharisees. And if you go home and you read through, particularly Matthew's Gospel, you will see all the way through this link of how Jesus didn't get on with the religious leaders. They were blind to who Jesus was. And because they'd had this face-off with him, they weren't ever prepared to listen to him. They weren't ever prepared to give him a chance. They were very sincere, but they were sincerely wrong. And we can be sincere about things, but be sincerely wrong. And they were sincerely wrong about Jesus. So what was it that they disliked about him so much? Well, they disliked his relationship with God, and that he claimed to be equal with God. He called himself Son of God, and they knew their Bibles as they studied them. They knew their scriptures well enough that when Jesus called himself the Son of God, he's saying to them, I am equal with God. In fact, for some of them, he was going further and saying, I am God. And they absolutely hated that. When he called himself the Christ or the Messiah, he was, in a way, declaring that he was equal with David and he was David's heir, and he was going to come in and he was going to change the order. And they again knew their theology, they knew God and they knew their teachings, and they knew that he was saying that I am God, and they disliked that. Jesus never called himself Son of David, but other people did. And every time they did that, particularly at Palm Sunday, the religious leader said, stop them, they're not allowed to do that, you're not the Son of David. So that was the first reason why they hated Jesus. He claimed he had authority to forgive sins. Do you remember the story of the man who was paralysed and his friends took him on a bed and they lowered him down through a roof? And when Jesus saw him, do you know what Jesus said to him? Your sins are forgiven. And they were furious. They didn't care that this man was healed and he managed to get up off his bed and he managed to walk home with it under his arm. They were furious that Jesus had said, your sins are forgiven, because as far as they were concerned, only God could forgive sins. And in Jesus saying that, he was saying, I'm God. He became a friend of sinners. They looked down on other people. And if you were going to associate with somebody who was a sinner, then you were no better than they were. So when Jesus went to the house of Matthew, or when he went to anywhere, they had a go. You can't be going there, they're not good people. Religious people aren't seen with them. Well, aren't religious people, aren't they the people that should be with those people who need help, who need support, who need care, who need love? And it's not surprising that Levi, who became Matthew, who wrote the Gospel, is actually the one man that more than anybody else has a lot to say about the religious leaders. They've probably given him such a hard time. He didn't observe their traditions. They washed their hands before meals, as we all should do, but on one occasion the disciples forgot to wash their hands. And they said to Jesus, why are your disciples not washing their hands? They're not clean, they shouldn't be doing that. And it was an oversight. But all the time they were trying to have a go at all these traditions that were so important to them that Jesus had forgotten about, or that Jesus didn't regard as important. It's not being about religious, it's about being a person of faith. And he didn't keep the Sabbath laws. And sometimes you get the idea that Jesus did it on purpose. He'd go to the synagogue and he'd heal somebody. He'd be out in the marketplace and he would heal somebody. He would bring somebody back to life, and he would touch the place that they'd been laid on, and it wasn't clean. And a man one day was healed in the synagogue, and he'd got a withered arm, and he'd held it out, and when he'd held it out, Jesus had made it absolutely perfect again. And wouldn't you have thought the Pharisees and the religious leaders would say, that is amazing, you've healed this man's arm. Instead they said, you can't do that on a Sabbath. And it just makes it ridiculous in a sense, doesn't it? But for them, it was vitally important. And that's why they hated Jesus. But then, when I was thinking this week, we may laugh at them. But then look at the foolishness that sometimes we are part of, and certainly the foolishness that our world is part of at the moment. So we're going to stand together and sing number 495. Dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our foolish pride. That's important. I brought an apple with me this morning. I don't normally like fruit, but I'm eating apples at the moment. And I picked this apple out of the fruit bowl and I thought, oh, that's a beautiful apple. It's really red and it's really shiny and it's got no imperfections at all. Do you like my apple? No? Somebody else doesn't like. Anybody else like apples at the back? I'll give it to the girls at the back if that's alright. It's a lovely apple and it looks absolutely perfect. There you go, have my apple. You'll have to share it between you, I'll take a bite each. Well, actually, when you think about it, it's all very well having a nice looking apple on the outside, but we all know that actually that's not necessarily mean it's going to be a good apple, because it isn't on the outside that's important, it's on the inside. And I'll tell you a story about a man who decided one day to go for a walk through an orchard full of apples, and as he walked through the apple orchard he saw all these apples in different places, and he thought, oh, which one shall I have? And he picked what he thought was the biggest and the reddest and the most beautiful apple, and he took it off the tree and he bit into it, and it was absolutely rotten, and he spat it out as quickly as he could. And you know, we can't always tell what something looks like, whether it looks good from the outside. You have to look inside to know whether something is good or whether it's bad. The apple looked good on the outside, but its goodness was only skin deep. And the same was true of some of those religious leaders. Their religion, their faith, was not from on the inside. It looked wonderful on the outside, but it wasn't there right in the centre. No, it's fine, don't worry. Their religion was skin deep. And what about you? And what about me? Do we look really Christian on the outside and present all the attributes of being good people, but on the inside our heart isn't right with God or with other people? It's on the inside that matters. Shall I flick it on? Thank you. Bit back, bit back. Go on, I'll do it. Nearly there. There we go. Practice what you preach. The word hypocrite is used 17 times in the Gospels. It's used 14 of those times in Matthew, which in a sense shows the relationship Matthew had with the religious leaders. Jesus is the only person to use the word hypocrite, and every single time he uses it of the religious leaders. Time and time again, and it came across particularly in those two readings, particularly the one that Ben read for us. Jesus calls them hypocrites. It means claiming to have higher standards than other people. It's all about pretending to be something that you're not. Well, we can all do that, can't we? We can all put a mask on and pretend sometimes that things are fine when they're not. We can all pretend to be something that we don't. A religious leader, quite a famous religious leader in the past few weeks, has stepped down from his position because of a relationship that he's alleged to have had with somebody else. And I'm not saying that he's done anything wrong, but we can all pretend to be something we aren't. And not surprising when Jesus called them hypocrites that they hated him and wanted to get rid of him. And all the time he was calling them out on the things that they did. They'd stand on a street corner and they wouldn't pray like this, they would pray like that. And if you're walking down the road and you see somebody praying like, well, if you see somebody like that, you might not necessarily know they were praying, but if you see somebody standing there like that, you know that that's what they're doing. And they weren't doing it so that because they wanted to talk to God, but they were doing it because they wanted everyone to see them. They gave away everything, 10% of your herbs, 10% of everything that is so tiny and minute, and yet when it came to mercy and justice and compassion, they didn't do those things. There was a very self-important Sunday school teacher, And one day she had her Sunday school class, and she was walking up and down and she was telling them about all the good things that she did and all the things that you needed to do to be a good Christian. And she said to them, "Now class, why do you think people call me a Christian?" And the children all sat there and nobody said a word. And eventually one little boy very tentatively put his hand up and he said, "Miss, is it because they don't know you very well?" Jesus criticised the religious leaders for doing one thing, for saying one thing and doing another. They thought that they were good, important, self-righteous. They wore their religiosity on their sleeves. But when he looked inside and he saw their hearts, he saw that they were hypocrites. Jesus wants us not to think of ourselves more highly than we should. You and I might be the only people that our friends and our social circle, the people we work with, we might be the only Christians they know. And therefore they're going to watch us so carefully. So what we say and how we live, they've got to match up. And what can we learn from them? Not when, how or what, but why. We have an order of service each Sunday for our services, and it lists the hymns and the prayers and the readings in what order we're doing them, and it helps Anne on the organ and it helps Dennis and Peter on the sound, and it's the way that we run through the service. But there was one church who had a new minister, and the church had always had their offering in a certain place in the service. And the minister decided he was going to move it to nearer the end of the service. Whoa, was there blood on the carpet at their church council? And actually, sometimes we can become so part. Well, we've always done it this way. It's about our traditions, about how we do and what we do, and not why we do it. The true worship comes from a heart that says, you know, it doesn't matter where we have the offering, but the fact that we do and why we do it. And that just doesn't go for offering, it goes for all sorts of things. So, were the religious leaders, were they villains? They certainly plotted and they certainly planned the killing of Jesus. So yes, they were, but Jesus gave them a hard time. And I think therein lies the dilemma for us today. For when people say that they are religious, Jesus looks at us to see how we're living and what we're doing. And we can condemn the Pharisees and those other religious leaders, but we've got to be very careful about the log in our own eyes. What is our attitude to worship? What about doing good things for other people? What is our attitude towards others? Are we judgmental about people who are different? Do we put ourselves first or others? Do I find fault very easily with other people and yet fail to see that I've got faults of my own? Am I critical and negative? Or am I loving and kind and understanding? We can be very sincere and yet be sincerely wrong. So the card I showed you later with the attributes of a priest. The Methodist Church doesn't have many doctrines, but one thing we do believe is the priesthood in all believers. So it's not just about the person who stands at the front with the dog collar as the religious leader. It's about all of us being priests wherever we are. So sometimes, yes, we might, wherever you are tomorrow, need the hide of a rhinoceros. But you may also need the vision of an eagle. You may also need the love of a mother. Because wherever you are tomorrow, people are going to be looking at you as the Christian. And they see Jesus through you and I. So we can have a go at them. And we do. And I have. But it's about you and me too. And where we are. So I'm going to invite you to lead us in our next hymn. We sang it last month at All Age Worship. We're going to do it again. This is Amazing Grace. And actually, however much Jesus condemned them, he still loved those religious leaders. As whenever we make a mistake or get something wrong, Jesus still loves you and I. His grace really is amazing. So I'm going to invite them to sing for us. When you're at the front, we'll start it.